Hey guys, so today we're going to talk about the Ottoman Empire. And although I wish that I was in class with you guys and everything else today, well, with everything that's going on, this is the best we can do. So the Ottoman Empire is going to take over essentially and rule parts of the old Islamic Empire, but mainly the Byzantine Empire. They're going to conquer all of Istanbul and then all the way up into Greece and other regions, but they really do become part of not only the Middle East and North Africa, but they really also become part of Europe. So they're kind of unique in that they're one of the first really transcontinental empires that actually interacts with all of the other regions. So previously, the Byzantine Empire. We had all kinds of stuff going on here with the Roman Empire split in half. The Byzantines took over. We had Justinian and his sweet code of laws, his wife. Then we have the Hagia Sophia, which is essentially the world's largest cathedral at the time period, which was the Eastern Orthodox Church's kind of masterpiece of a church. You've got religion going on, some great schism and everything else that happens there where they split from the Catholic Church. And then, well, the Ottomans come rolling in. So the Ottoman Empire did not begin in 1453. The images below show the growth of the Osmanli Empire, named for the founder, go figure, Osman the First. And he ruled this little tiny green thing. Then he slowly starts to expand it out by 1359. And then he takes over Istanbul. And that's going to be the big one. So Constantinople, or Istanbul, as it would later get changed to name-wise, becomes kind of the big thing that the Ottomans take over. And when they take it over, ultimately that is the end of the Byzantine Empire. Right? So the Ottomans essentially begin here. They start in their first conquest, and then as they expand out, they start to create vassal states. And vassal states are literally just like vassals in medieval Europe, where they're people that essentially are loyal to the empire and owe a whole bunch of stuff to the empire, but they're not actually part of it. And we're going to see that kind of become a thing with the Ottomans that they try to expand on, and that's going to be how they actually really look to expand their empire. So by 1451, they have now taken over quite a bit more space. They've left that little area and kind of near Constantinople alone, and they've added Wallachia, which we'll talk more about next week. So, Ottoman Empire. First off, their big thing. The Turks essentially, and the Ottoman Turks are going to be the same people. There was really only one thing in the way by 1453, and it was the remaining walls of Constantinople. So the reason why it was such a problem is because there was an outer wall, there was an inner wall, and there was a moat in between them. So it's three different walls that you have to scale after you've already crossed over like water to begin with, which makes it remarkably hard, especially because as you can kind of see in here, the city is literally split right down the middle. So there's water on each side, and there were chains that they could lift that essentially just made it impassable for any boats to get through. They had these gigantic chains, and they would lift them up. Any boat that would try to go through them isn't going to happen. Wood isn't stronger than steel, so all of the wood eventually would just fold. And they would have these chains set up all over the place. So whenever they wanted to cross, they would lift the chains up, put boards across of it, and then boom, became a bridge. But whenever they wanted to defend themselves, they could just lower it down.
The most important walls in Western history aren't even in the West. They surround the modern city of Istanbul, Constantinople as the Romans called it, and for 1,000 years, the fate of Europe depended on them. Constantinople was designed to be the center of the world. When the frontiers of the Roman Empire began to crumble in the 4th century, the capital was moved to the cultured, wealthy, and still stable East. There, at the crossroads between Europe and Asia, the hub of the major trade routes of the ancient world, the Emperor Constantine built his city. This was the city of libraries and universities, 20 times the size of London or Paris at the time. It contained the priceless knowledge of the classical world which was fading in the West. To protect this masterpiece from its many enemies, Constantine's successors built the finest defensive fortifications ever made. The first line of protection was a moat 60 feet wide and 22 feet deep, stretching all 4 miles from coast to coast. Pipes from inside the city could fill it at the first sight of the enemy, and a short wall protected archers who could fire at the soaked soldiers trying to swim across. Those who were lucky enough to clear the moat had to contend with an unceasing barrage from the 27-foot outer wall above. Arrows, spears, or far worse, Greek fire, an ancient form of napalm that would ignite on contact and couldn't be extinguished by water, would rain down on them. Squads of Roman defenders would carry portable flamethrowers, spraying anyone trying to climb out of the moat. The terrified victims would leap back only to find that they still burned underwater. At times, the Romans would also mount siphons onto the ramparts and launch clay pots full of Greek fire from catapults at an invading army. The front lines would turn into an inferno, making it appear as if the earth itself was on fire. If by some miracle the outer wall was compromised, attackers would be faced with the final defense, the great inner wall. These walls were wide enough to have 4 men ride side by side, allowing troops to be rushed wherever they were needed. Attila the Hun, destroyer of civilizations who named himself the Scourge of God, took one look at them and turned around. The Avars battled the walls uselessly till their catapults ran out of rocks. The Turks tried to tunnel under them, but found the foundations too solid. The Arabs tried to starve the city into submission, but ran out of food themselves and had to resort to cannibalism. It took the guns of the modern world to finally bring them down. In 1453, the Turks brought their superweapon, a monster cannon that could fire a 1,500-pound stone ball over a mile. Together with more than 100 smaller guns, they kept up a steady bombardment day and night. A section of the old walls collapsed, but even in their death throes, they proved formidable. The rubble absorbed the shock of the cannonballs better than the solid wall. It took a month and a half of continuous blasting to finally open a breach. The last Roman emperor, Constantine XI, drew his sword and jumped into the gap to stop the onrushing horde, disappearing into legend. The city was taken, and the Roman Empire finally disappeared, but those broken walls had one last gift. As the survivors fled the doomed city, they brought with them their precious books and their ancient traditions. They traveled west to Italy, reintroduced the Greek language and learning to Western Europe, and ignited the Renaissance. Thanks to Constantinople's walls, that pile of brick and marble that guarded them for so long, we still have our classical past.
So whenever we look at the Ottomans and the reason why they were able to take over, this was what's called their monster cannon. And it literally was the first real true form of artillery. The cannon itself was significantly larger than anything that had ever been seen before in terms of weaponry, and was able to fire rocks that previously catapults literally would crumble under. So when they showed up with this, it really and truly was the ultimate game changer. The city was quickly pillaged, but what about the Hagia Sophia? It was essentially this gigantic church, and it really was kind of a devout place, and it was still a beautiful building. So, what were the Ottomans going to do with it? Mehmed II, the emperor that actually was ruling the Ottomans whenever they conquered the city, ordered an imam to the church, and he made it a mosque. They remove all the bells and altars, and the mosaics are all plastered over, which is kind of a sad part for history here. And this is what it ended up looking like. This is current day, what the Hagia Sophia looks like. It's still a gigantic building. It is still one of the world's greatest mosques. It's arguably the most beautiful one, if you kind of would look at inner beauty in terms of design and architecture. But it was forever changed. The insides, all of a sudden now, are covered in script, and it served as a mosque from 1453 all the way until 1935. Right? And then the question is, well, what about now? Since then, it's essentially served as a museum and a center of tourism. It's no longer an active mosque. It's not actually, a practicing one. However, it is preserved in the best way that they can to kind of acknowledge both of its traditions. So you can see some of the old um, paintings and murals now that used to be plastered over, but not all of them really remain. The Sultan ordered a complete renovation in the 1840s. And during this, all the Italian restorers found these mosaics under the plaster, but had to replaster them, which sucks. So they find all these beautiful mosaics made from all the tile underneath, but because it was still an active mosque, they had to plaster back over it. So this is what it looked like in 1840, and then this is how it looked in 1931, and you can kind of tell they literally just covered up some of the oldest and kind of coolest traditional art that had been in existence for over 1,000 years at this point. Um, all of them actually start kind of looking at it, and once it becomes a museum, they realize, well, nobody really cares about a plain plaster wall, but people might want to actually see what's behind that. So they start tearing down the plaster. The bottom parts were destroyed in the restoration process, but the top remains. This is what it actually looks like because they use different colored stone. So this isn't painted. It's literally just the stone themselves are these colors. And it's a series of small stones that are all stacked next to each other. And that's what makes it a mosaic. So this is a mosaic of Mary, Jesus, and John the Baptist. They weren't able to restore the bottom part because the stone came out at some point during all of the replastering. And this is what it looks like today. So even now, behind all of those other plastered walls, we really don't know what beautiful things kind of lurk behind them because they're just deteriorated and gone. It's why, in all honesty, some parts of history are just kind of erased and written over. This is one of those examples. So here is the Hagia Sophia right in the center. And if you're looking at kind of everything else that exists within there, these are kind of all of the other major things to look at in Istanbul today. So there's the Bosphorus Bridge, the Hagia Sophia is down there, which is right next to the actual mosque that's used today, along with the Topkapi Palace, which is in there. There's famous fountains and hippodromes and obelisks and bazaars, and all kinds of new and old kind of blending together into what is, in all honesty, probably the most important city to the ancient world. So let's talk about the people that actually ruled here, right? So now that they've captured Rome, like the Roman Empire, which was the Byzantines, how will they staff their government and military? So they use a process called devshirme. And I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, but go ahead and pronounce it the way you want to. But it's called the collecting. And this is going to be arguably the most important and controversial thing that the Ottomans do. It's called the collecting because it is a blood tax on families from Southeast Europe. So anyone that is European, especially Christians, it is a blood tax on them. And, well, how did it work? Ottomans sent military officers to take Christian boys ages 8 to 18. They literally would round them up and bring them into the city. They're then converted to Islam and raised by the state. They essentially go into what would amount to modern day orphanages. There were 4 possible institutions: the palace. So clearly, if you were the best of the best, you got sent to the palace. The scribes, which again, not too bad. Religion, so you could essentially become a practicing member of Islam and then ultimately go on to lead kind of the conversion efforts later on. Or last one, the military. And that's where the Janissaries are going to come in, and we'll talk about them in a little bit here. They had 50,000-ish by 1650, and every family was expected to give up one or all of their boys, depending on kind of how the emperor felt that day. It was abolished by 1700, which means it didn't last that long, but still for 200 years, the Ottomans collected boys from every family. The best of the best recruits went to the palace school, so they were all there. The best graduates of the school went on to become Grand Vizier. It was the prime minister to the Sultan, and it was the second highest ranking person in the empire, which is kind of crazy to think that you would have an outsider, a Christian, right? A Christian boy who was brought in and then converted to Islam would then ultimately go on to work right under the Sultan, right? That's kind of crazy. Some notable Grand Viziers who were from the Devshirme system would essentially go on to be Zaganos. He was Greek and Serbian. Mahmud was again Greek, Hungarian, which is going to be a little bit different. That was Hadim Suleiman. He's going to be kind of a big deal for Suleiman, who, as we'll talk about, is kind of the number one guy in all of the Ottomans. But you'll notice all of them have kind of a stint that's rather short, right? And then whenever we get to Rustem, he was from Croatia, so he was a Croat. He actually married the Sultan's daughter. He was the wealthiest vizier in history because, well, he married a princess. And he's the only vizier to serve under 3 different sultans here, which is kind of crazy. So he first becomes vizier in 1544, and he remains on all the way until 1579. So he spends a long time in power. But the most famous of all of them were the Janissaries. So the Janissaries, think of them almost as like, I don't know, early special forces. They were famed for their strict discipline and order. They were paid by the Sultan, so they owed complete allegiance to him. Other forms of people that were in the military didn't get paid, but the Janissaries did. They were professional soldiers. They were part of a well-oiled military machine, and the Sultan would dress as a Janissary to visit the men as a fellow Janissary himself, so that way, essentially, he would blend in with the men. When the Ottomans are referred to as a gunpowder empire, these guys are the ones that control the gunpowder. It's all the Janissaries. And again, this is part of what makes the Ottoman Empire very different. They give all of these outsiders, all these people from Europe, control by making them viziers and their special forces, and they're the ones that are the elites within the empire, even though they aren't actually Arabs at all, right? The Turks didn't really care. The Ottoman Turks weren't Arabs themselves, so even though they conquer into Arabia and they still have some like major parts of their empire that are Arab, ultimately, their elite level people are going to be European converts that they basically take from their families and say, we are all that you have now. Your family abandoned you. You are now part of our family.
The Ottomans basically controlled about half of what the Romans controlled, but it was much more valuable because of all that Indian Ocean trade you remember from last week. So all this land brought a lot of wealth, but it needed to be ruled. The Ottomans could have followed the Roman model, where you send out generals and nobles to rule over conquered territories, or they could have demanded the allegiance of client kings like the Persians, or developed a civil service system like the Chinese. But instead, they created an entirely new ruling class, a system that some historians call the slave aristocracy. So if you're a king, one of your main problems is hereditary nobles, because they always want to replace you, and they don't want to give you your money, and they want their ugly sons to marry your gorgeous daughters, etc. One way to deal with this problem is to make them part of the government so they feel included and shut up. Another way is to kill them. That's what they usually do in Russia. I'm whispering so Putin doesn't hear me. The Ottomans just bypassed the problem of hereditary nobles altogether by creating both an army and a bureaucracy from scratch so they would be loyal only to the Sultan. How? The Devshirme, a program in which they kidnapped Christian boys, converted them to Islam, and raised them either to be part of an elite military fighting force called the Janissaries or to be government bureaucrats. Incidentally, which of those gigs would you prefer? Because I think that says a lot about you as a person. Either way, you weren't allowed to have kids, which prevented the whole hereditary nobles problem, and also ensured that the Ottoman government would contain quite a lot of eunuchs. Oh, it's time for the open letter? An open letter to Ottoman eunuchs. But first, let's see what's in the secret compartment today. Oh, it's a blow-up globe. See what quitting smoking will get you, me from the past? Hey there, Ottoman eunuchs, how's it hanging? I'm just kidding, that was mean. Listen, there have been eunuchs all around this great planet of ours. But you're special. I'm not going to get into the details of why, because they're horrifying. I'm just going to link to an article in the video info. You started out just being harem guards, Ottoman eunuchs, which is kind of an obvious gig for you. But then you expanded. As had happened in China, you made yourselves indispensable, and you were often the center of palace intrigue. In fact, few people in the Ottoman Empire were as wealthy and important as many of you were. Way to turn lemons into lemonade. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have brought up lemons. Best wishes, John Green. This system eventually broke down as the Janissaries, who had guns, lobbied to be allowed to have families. But until that happened, the Ottoman system of using a mix of slave administrators and eunuchs to run everything worked incredibly well.
Yeah, because if you don't have anything, then obviously the government is going to kind of be everything to you, right? So that's the fun little bit that gets left out a lot, is that all of the Janissaries and all of the people that get collected in there, they're all eunuchs too. So if you thought that that whole idea of not being allowed to reproduce was going to go away, it doesn't. So after Constantinople falls, this is where the world begins to take notice of the Osmanli Empire. So they are there. It is a 53-day siege of the Byzantine capital. It's led by 21-year-old Mehmed II the Conqueror, which, if you're going to come down to nicknames again, pretty solid one. The Roman Empire's 1400-year existence is now over, right? So the eastern half of the Roman Empire has officially fallen. It officially puts an end to the use of city walls as a viable defense strategy as well, because, well, now that people find out that guns can tear down city walls really fast, they're going to use them everywhere, which instantly makes walls no longer matter. Yeah. The flag of the Ottoman Empire is going to be the crescent moon with a star, and I really wish that it would show up. For some reason, a lot of the images aren't popping up today on my PowerPoint, and saying that they can't be identified. So the moon and star date back to summer. The Parthian Persians use it as well, and it's the original flag of Byzantium. Also, it's used very early on in Turkic states, but if you're wondering what the flag looks like, it's the icon at the top of the screen. It's the half circle with the star. It's literally like the emblem now for essentially Islam. Right? So whenever it comes down to the capturing of the Byzantium, or I'm sorry, well, of the Byzantine Empire at Constantinople, and then later renamed Istanbul, because, you know, enough names for one city could never be there. It also comes down to the next three of these battles as well. So this battle is going to be the Battle of Caldrian, and it's the first and most influential meeting between the Ottomans and the Safavids, which are going to be the group of people we talk about in a little bit. Two of our land-based empires squared off during this time period, so the Safavids are going to be one of the other ones, so that's kind of a big deal. The Sunni Ottomans were expanding to the east, whereas the Safavids, who were Shia, were expanding to the west, so naturally, whenever east meets west, boom. It starts 41 years of battles between the Ottomans and the Safavids. And the Ottoman army was about 100,000 people with way more artillery, and the Safavid army had about 80,000 people. Whenever Shah Ismail's wives are all captured by the Ottomans, things essentially don't go well for him. He retires from all public life afterwards, and then the Ottomans move on to briefly capture the Safavid capital, which we'll also kind of talk about a little bit later when we talk about the Safavids. Then moving more into Europe, we get into the Battle of Lepanto. The upstart Ottomans essentially end their dominance of the Mediterranean Sea, and they really do essentially come up against the rest of Europe. They end up fighting the Papal States, Spain, Venice, Tuscany, and Malta all together, which really is kind of a lot of money thrown behind stuff. But anytime that you can get most of Italy and Spain together, that's not going to be a bad thing for an army in the 1500s now that Spain has got all this money. The Ottomans start sailing west from Lepanto. The Holy League, as it was called, essentially starts sailing east from Sicily. And again, whenever west and east meet, boom. It's the last major battle fought almost entirely with rowing ships. So after this point in time, you're going to see it's just going to be ships with sails. But, well, the Mediterranean is nowhere near as windy as the Atlantic and the Pacific, so they relied more on rowing. It's the beginning of the Age of the Sail, and this would be the largest naval battle since antiquity. 400 warships. There was an infantry battle on floating platforms. So essentially, they would just slam one ship into another and then try to run across and still fight hand to hand. Suleiman, who essentially was the sultan of all sultans in the Ottoman Empire, scared Europe with his victories, and ultimately Lepanto ended that fear because, well, the Ottomans don't exactly do so hot. Then the Battle of Vienna essentially stops the Ottomans from entering Europe completely. So Lepanto was the way that they stopped taking over the Mediterranean. So Spain and Italy and you could argue maybe even France didn't have to worry about them anymore. But the Ottomans started expanding to the north as well. And, well, Vienna is going to be the end of that expansion. The Ottoman Turks ceased to be a menace to the Christian world after this point. Vienna had been under siege for 2 months, and the Austrians, the Polish Lithuanians, and the Holy Roman Empire all joined forces together. The Ottomans were all led by Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha. If you remember back kind of whenever we were looking at him, he's the one that has kind of been the longest ruler. He was the one that married the Sultan's daughter. And when he was fighting, essentially, this is going to lead to kind of an issue because he loses. And after he loses, he also loses his title of Grand Vizier. He no longer becomes the Grand Vizier because of this battle. This is the end of Ottoman expansion into Europe. But even though they had the largest cavalry charge in history here, they had 25,000 troops on horseback ride into battle, and they lose. Genghis Khan would have been very disappointed. So Suleiman the Magnificent. So Suleiman the Lawgiver is part of his nickname. Suleiman the Magnificent for his military victories. Suleiman the Caliph because he proclaimed himself not only leader of the government but also leader of the religion. Suleiman's dad was Selim I, and he expanded Ottoman rule into Egypt, defeated the Safavids at Caldrian. So then comes along Suleiman, and I just kind of brought him up in the last one and said he was Suleiman the Magnificent because, well, he kind of wins everything and expands out more than anyone else. He was the ruler from 1520 to 1566, so a 46-year run, pretty solid. Expanded the empire and fought for 23 years with the Safavids. He ruled over 25 million people in his empire, so pretty good run. He was pen pals with Akbar the Great, who was the leader of the Mughals, who we'll talk about tomorrow, and ultimately ruled at the peak of all of the Ottomans' power. When he died, this was kind of when everything falls apart. 5 years after his death, they have the loss of Lepanto, and really that was kind of the beginning of the end of their expansion. As a lawgiver, he essentially came up with the Sultanic laws and the Sharia laws and blended them together. So he turns the law of Islam together with the law of the land to kind of combine it into one big set of laws for the entirety of everyone. He studied the previous 9 sultans, and then he matched all of their rulings with the Quran to essentially establish this law system. On the Turk side are the resources of a mighty empire, strength unimpaired, habituation to victory, endurance of toil, unity, discipline, frugality, and watchfulness. Can we doubt what the result will be when the Turks have settled with Persia? They will fly to at our throats, supported by the might of the whole East. How unprepared we are, I dare not say, was the Austrian ambassador's message to the Ottoman Empire. And he basically said, hey, we understand that this is going to be kind of an issue. So he sent this back to Austria and was like, guys, if the Ottomans all come here after they defeat the Safavids, we're going to have a serious problem. Suleiman's Ottoman Empire really did strike fear into everyone in Europe. They thought that Islam was going to just come barreling through. The Ottoman Golden Age does peak under Suleiman because, like I said, 5 years after his death, well, everything kind of goes south. So here's some other things that he did, though. So this is the community of the talented. It's the heart of the Ottoman rule and education system, which was the Topkapi Palace. So if you remember, it's right next to the Hagia Sophia, pretty much. Mehmed the Conqueror ordered its construction, and it was the seat of all of the sultans from 1459 all the way until 1856. The Erdogan School for the Devshirme Palace training was here. So if you were trying to become the Vizier or essentially part of the government, this is where you got trained. There were over 40 different fields of study with 2,000 plus members in it. It attracted the most talented artists and scholars in the empire, including painting, calligraphy, rug making, boot making, blacksmiths. It really was kind of the center of all training. And that's where it was, right? So right next to the Hagia Sophia. After this, then you're going to see the Suleimani Mosque. It becomes the largest Ottoman mosque in Istanbul. You got to throw a little asterisk there because, well, it's not bigger than the Hagia Sophia, so they can't really claim it. Suleiman and many other sultans is and are buried here. And it is a prime example of monumental architecture used by rulers where whenever rulers take over a place, they build gigantic monuments to commemorate their lives. This stems all the way back from things like the pyramids, but keeps going and going all throughout history, where we're going to see rulers build gigantic things to celebrate the fact that, well, they were great. So as you can see, it's not quite as big as the Hagia Sophia, but it's not bad. Right? So Japan and Europe were feudal system based. The Manchus, which we didn't necessarily get to them very much, had the banner system, which we'll talk about at some point in the next couple weeks. But how did the Ottomans really organize their society? The way that they did it was based on millets. These were nations. So different religious communities in the Ottoman Empire had different certain amounts of autonomy. So they broke everyone into one of these four millets. They had the Rome nation, which was essentially anyone who was part of the Orthodox Church. They had the Armenian nation, they had the Jewish nation, and then they had the Catholic nation. None of them were really fully official systems that they used to kind of govern the four until the 1700s. But once it becomes the actual law of the land, it becomes kind of unique and different. The idea predates the fall of Constantinople with Mehmed I in 1410. But essentially what they did is they broke up the entire city into four different regions for the others. So essentially it meant that if you were part of the Orthodox Church, you could live in this part of the city. The Armenians lived in the different part. The Jews lived in a different part. The Catholics lived in a different part. But Muslims were able to live in all of it. It tied to the Islamic rules regarding the protected peoples because all of these people believed in the same God. So because of that, they essentially protected them. They didn't kill them. They didn't wipe them out, but they were allowed to practice their faith within the actual empire itself. They set their own laws, so they governed themselves. They collected taxes. They essentially kept everything within themselves. The only requirement was loyalty to the Ottoman Sultan and state. So they could run themselves. They could collect their own taxes. They could have their own little kind of mayors within the city. But when it all kind of came down to it all, the Ottoman Sultan, when he said, "I need you here now," you needed to come. So Manchus had their bannermen, Russia the boyars, Mughals will have the zamindars. But who collects the Ottoman taxes? And again, all those people are people that we'll talk about later. So tax farming. The iltizams are going to be the people who are essentially in charge of collecting taxes. They were sold off to the highest bidders, and they essentially were tax farms. They were literally regions of the city that allowed nobles to collect taxes from that region. So when this is kind of used, essentially think of it as like selling off the tax collector rights in this, like for parts of the city. But in order to get them, you had to not only pay for them initially in like a bidding, but then also had to be able to collect your taxes in your region. So you had to be strong enough to enforce all of that while also having the money to kind of back it from the beginning. It was usually for a 3-year investment, and during that time, you could make up to 5 times your investment back, right? As long as you were able to actually enforce it. Benefits to it, it guaranteed a fixed amount of money for the state. So essentially, the government was able to get money right out the gate from wealthy nobles who would pay them for that part of territory. So it didn't matter if there was a bad harvest that year or not. The government already had their money from 3 years ago. So disasters or military losses was all the responsibility of the iltizam, so the people that bought these tax farms, not the actual Ottomans themselves. It also encouraged an increase in trade. So tax farmers would benefit by any increase in production or taxable trade. So naturally, they were looking to do it. And there was no need for a complex bureaucracy and dealing with tax collecting and everything else. You could just put it on the noble that paid for the region. And it's pre-existing. The Ottomans basically just adopted this when they took over. It had already been in use. When it comes to the Ottoman Empire, in terms of artwork and other things, essentially, whenever you look at all of these, they're all little miniatures. See, look, miniatures. But whenever they do it, they painted one thing into another. So we'll look at that real quick here.
History has been recorded in many ways. During the Ottoman Empire, these miniature paintings told the story of the day. Called tashwir or nakish in the Ottoman language, these paintings depicted events from the ordinary to the historic. Although Islam has traditionally forbidden the painting of human images, miniatures have been around much longer than any sultan. The earliest account of the ancient art dates back to the 2nd century BC. The conquest of Istanbul in 1453 was the first step into the new phase of Ottoman cultural life. That was when East met West, and miniature art flourished.
Etkilenmemiş olmasını düşünemeyeceğimiz kadar etkilememiş olmasını da düşünemeyiz. Bugün minyatür işte Türkiye genelinde bile çok tanınan sanatlardan bir tanesi haline geldi. Bu bir aşktır, bu bir sevdadır yani. Ama kalite açısından dediğim gibi çok öyle hani çok fazla sanatsal görebileceğimiz bir minyatür değildir. Daha naif, daha sade, daha çok anlatıma dayalı.
Ottoman miniatures display realism based on close observations. Refined details are rare.
Bana sorarsanız çocuk resmidir bu. Yani sanatın başladığı nokta diyebiliriz. Çünkü son derece saf, sadece stilize, ışık gölge kaygısı gütmeden.
The technical characteristics of miniature art are quite different from, say, English Renaissance art. Perspective and shading do not exist in miniature art. Rather, the principle is to reflect the contours of the subject matter, thereby allowing the artist to portray many different scenes at the same time.
The scenes depicted in miniature art could include different periods and spaces.
Back in medieval times, paper was a luxury. It wasn't a material that could be obtained easily. So the artists had to work more practically to put everything up on the paper.
which is why they wrote so small. But essentially, the art of the Ottomans was literally, think of it almost like newspaper art. And next part here. So the Ottoman sultans had a unique system of picking an heir. And this is kind of a huge break and a gigantic jump, but, well, it kind of has to get covered nonetheless. So the way that they picked their heir is called the kafe. So it literally is the cage. Succession struggles led to royal families being slaughtered by an heir. So to get rid of that, they locked all the presumptive heirs in cafes until it was time to choose one. They put them inside of a cage so they literally wouldn't kill each other. Started in 1617, the last Ottoman Sultan was in the cage until he was 56 years old in 1918. So essentially, they lived, all the heirs lived within a cage in the castle. And when it says a cage, it essentially is a room. It's not literally a cage. But because all of like the heirs would literally kill each other to become the next sultan, they would lock them in their rooms pretty much until the current ruler passed away, and then he chose who his heir would be. So whenever it comes to the Ottomans, their rule kind of continues all the way until World War One. But whenever we look at them, we really are only talking about this time period because after Suleiman, they kind of go on, well, this decline. And so this is the Ottoman decline thesis. The now defunct theory, so it's no longer really accepted, but it kind of is still taught a lot, is that the Ottoman Empire continually declined following the death of Suleiman in 1566. The main ideas of it are essentially that the first 10 sultans are great, but the rest all become incompetent. The Ottoman Empire is oftentimes referred to as the sick old man of Europe, and you're going to literally hear that whenever we talk about World War One. And the military got worse after each loss. Their inability to add to the empire meant that they were a failure as an empire. And as the new world kind of was explored over in the Americas, the Ottomans essentially lose economic importance. Spanish silver inflation ruined Ottoman coins, and there was an unwillingness to adopt or adapt to new European innovations. And ultimately, they think that the Ottomans reverted to a medieval state. Now, all of these things are things that are kind of preached and taught a lot, but there kind of is a rebuttal to a lot of it all. So, problems with that. One, Ottoman writers throughout history complained about the times. It essentially was the first actual meme. It wasn't an accurate account of the decline of the empire. Militaries, including Janissaries, continued to innovate into the 1700s. But they do fall behind by not participating in the 7 Years' War, which we'll talk about later. The Ottomans essentially had setbacks, but were simply not improving as fast as their rivals in the West. And that's really their problem, is that they started so much higher up than the rest of Europe that even though they were gradually increasing, well, Europeans started skyrocketing. So as the Ottomans switched from empire building to bureaucracy and maintaining their empire, they just slowly got better. But you'll see kind of the rest of Europe starts advancing much, much faster and starts gaining wealth and power much, much quicker. I'm sorry that this went so long. I know that this kind of took up a ton of time, but I wish that we could have split it into 2 days and talked about it a lot more, but we can't. So that is the Ottomans. They over. So the next part is going to be the Safavids, and I will post a video on them tomorrow. But I will also do the Safavids and the Mughals. I should be able to finish both in a single time because it's a lot shorter. So look for that to get posted either later today or tomorrow. And then there will be a 10-question quiz that'll be posted up on Canvas. So you'll see that, you'll do that, and I'll see you guys on Monday. Have a great day, everybody.